You think you know the story of Adam and Eve. You think it ends with a gate slammed shut, a flaming sword guarding Eden, and two figures walking into the unknown. But what if I told you that was only the opening act of a much greater war? A war so dangerous, so revealing that for centuries, they tried to erase it from history. For over 60 years, a book lay buried in an Egyptian tomb, hidden from the eyes of the world. Now it has been found, and its pages, preserved by the ancient Ethiopian church, tell a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the first man, the first woman, and the enemy who still hunts us today. This is the lost book of Adam and Eve, and it holds a terrifying secret. In the next hour, we will walk with Adam and Eve into the cave of treasures. We will watch the first deception after Eden uncover the sisters you never knew existed, and follow a bloodline from the mountain of holiness to the giants before the flood. We will trace these secrets through Ethiopia's hidden manuscripts until they collide with the final pages of Revelation. And to understand the terrifying secret they hid, we must go back to the tomb where the scroll was sealed. Chapter 1. The Tomb and the Forbidden Scroll. It began in the sands of Upper Egypt, where the desert keeps its secrets better than any vault. For centuries, wind and time had buried a royal tomb under layers of silence. The name on the stone was almost forgotten. Tukan-Ain, an Egyptian noble whose life had intersected with the whispers of early Christianity and the trade routes of the ancient world. When archaeologists broke the seal, they expected gold ornaments and the fragments of a long-dead dynasty. What they found instead was stranger and far more dangerous, a bundle of ancient parchment wrapped in linen, hidden not in the main burial chamber, but in a concealed alcove, as if someone wanted it protected or hidden. These were not hieroglyphs. They were not written in the language of pharaohs, but in an ancient Ge'ez script, the sacred language of Ethiopia's oldest churches. Alongside the parchments lay a cedar box carved with crosses and strange symbols of a tree, a serpent, and two human figures. The lead archaeologist later admitted in a private letter, "It was as if the tomb was a passageway between worlds, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Eden itself." Inside the box was the text the world had not seen in centuries, the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, what modern scholars would call the lost book of Adam and Eve. When its first translation was published in 1926, the academic world reacted like someone had just detonated a theological bomb. The book didn't rewrite Genesis, it continued it. It spoke of Adam and Eve after the expulsion from Eden, their first nights in darkness, their prayers, their confrontations with Satan himself. For some, it was a missing chapter in humanity's oldest story. For others, it was dangerous fiction. Very quickly, the debate turned into suppression. Prominent Western theologians dismissed it as pseudepigrapha, a forged work falsely attributed to ancient authors. That single label was enough to convince seminaries and churches to ignore it. The implication was clear: this is not inspired. This is not scripture. It has no authority. But in Ethiopia, the reaction was different. For them, this was not an apocryphal curiosity, it was part of a living tradition. Ethiopian Christians had preserved the text in their canon for centuries alongside the Book of Enoch and other writings excluded from the Western Bible. They never saw it as a contradiction to Genesis, but as a vital continuation filling the silence between Eden's gate and the lives of Adam and Eve in exile. One Ethiopian scholar, when asked why they still kept the book, gave a haunting answer: "Genesis is the prologue. This is the battle." That sentence struck like a blade. It implied that Western Christianity had been reading only the opening lines of a war without knowing how it unfolded. And if the battle was still raging, ignorance was the enemy's greatest advantage. The more you study the book's history, the more it looks like a pattern we've seen before: sacred texts emerging from the margins, embraced by one tradition, rejected by another, buried under accusations until the memory fades. But the text survived not in libraries of Europe, but in mountain monasteries and stone churches of Ethiopia, guarded like a prophetic weapon. And here is the investigative question that cannot be ignored if the Book of Adam and Eve was truly irrelevant or false. Why did it survive for millennia in Ethiopia's canon? Why did someone hide it in an Egyptian noble's tomb, wrapped and sealed as if it were treasure? And why in 1926 did it appear only to vanish again from public discourse? When you trace the trail, the suppression looks deliberate. The rejection wasn't based on archaeological evidence or linguistic flaws. It was based on theology. The book speaks too much of spiritual warfare, too plainly of Satan's strategies, too vividly of the cost of obedience after Eden. It is not sanitized for polite religion. It is raw, urgent, and uncomfortably close to reality, which leaves us with the same choice the archaeologists had when they opened that cedar box. Do we close it again and pretend we never saw it? Or do we dare to read what Adam and Eve themselves wanted us to know about the war that began the moment they left the garden? Because if Genesis is the prologue, then what's written in this book might just tell us how the war ends. And that takes us directly into the exile, into the Cave of Treasures, where the first night outside Eden still echoes. Chapter 2. Exiled into the Cave of Treasures. When the gates of Eden shut behind them, the air changed. Gone was the fragrance of the garden, the warmth of unbroken fellowship. The earth beneath their feet was dry, cracked, and sharp. The light seemed thinner, as if the sun itself grieved. Adam and Eve were no longer clothed in glory, only in the rough garments God had sewn for them, coverings of mercy in a world that would now wound them. The book of Adam and Eve describes their first journey stumbling across a barren plain until they reached the mouth of a cave. It was no palace, no sanctuary, yet this would be their dwelling. The Ethiopian tradition calls it the Cave of Treasures. The name sounds almost deceptive. There were no jewels, no gold. The treasure was something far more dangerous to keep the memory of God's presence and the promise that one day redemption would come. Inside, the air was cold and damp. Shadows clung to the walls. Adam and Eve had never known darkness before. In Eden, day and night were filled with God's light. Now the blackness pressed against them, an almost physical force. Here, in this hollow of the earth, they were to begin their training not for comfort, but for war. The text says Adam fell on the floor of the cave and wept until his voice failed. Eve wept beside him, both of them overwhelmed by the crushing weight of separation. And it was here in this moment of deepest weakness that the enemy struck. Satan had not been idle since the expulsion. The book says he approached the cave not in rage but with a calculated malice, carrying with him the one weapon he knew could undo them: despair. In the silence of the night, Adam heard a sound that was neither wind nor beast. A low guttural wail rose into a howl so piercing it felt as though the walls of the cave would split. This was not the roar of a predator, it was the voice of hatred itself. The text describes it as a cry that entered into their bones as if to shatter the courage God had left in them. Eve clung to Adam, trembling. Adam pressed his hands to his ears, but the sound was inside him. And then came the words, mocking, twisting, aimed to poison hope. "Look at you now," the voice taunted. "From glory to dust, from the throne to the pit. You will never see the garden again. The one who made you has abandoned you." But in that cave something happened the enemy did not expect. Adam, through the tears, began to pray. Not the easy prayers of Eden, but the desperate cry of a soul in exile. "O Lord, do not forsake the work of your hands." Eve's voice joined his, and the darkness seemed to recoil. The Cave of Treasures became in that moment more than a shelter. It became the first altar outside Eden, the first battleground where prayer was not a ritual, but a weapon. Here they began to learn what all exiles must learn, that the absence of God's visible presence does not mean the absence of God. Ethiopian tradition holds that in this cave Adam kept certain sacred things given by God before the expulsion, symbols of a covenant yet to be fulfilled. It was a place of both grief and preparation, a holding ground for the promise that a son would come to crush the serpent's head. And maybe that's why Satan's scream still matters. It was not just an outburst, it was an admission. The enemy knew that even outside Eden, the war was not over. The Cave of Treasures would forge warriors out of the broken. The text ends this scene with Adam lifting his head and saying, "We will not leave this cave until the Lord commands us." That is the resolve that makes the enemy tremble, not perfect circumstances, but unshakable loyalty in the worst of them. And it is in this same cave on another night that the enemy would return, not with a scream, but with a disguise so beautiful it could almost pass for a blessing. Chapter 3. The Enemy's First Disguise. The Cave of Treasures had become a place of prayer and survival. Adam and Eve were beginning to adjust to their new reality, gathering food from the barren land, seeking water in the cracks of stone, offering daily petitions to the God they could no longer see. But in war, the enemy rarely strikes the same way twice. The first attack had been blunt darkness, fear, despair. It had failed. Now Satan would come with something far more dangerous: beauty. The book of Adam and Eve tells us that one day, as Adam wandered a short distance from the cave in search of food, he saw a figure in the distance. The sun caught her skin like polished onyx. Her hair, long and flowing, shimmered in the heat. She moved with a grace Adam had never seen outside of Eve herself. Her eyes held an intensity that seemed to pierce his soul, and when she spoke, her voice carried the melody of rivers and the whisper of the wind. This woman was no ordinary stranger. She was a fabrication, a perfect illusion woven by the adversary himself. Every detail was calculated not just to attract Adam, but to make him forget. Forget the pain of exile. Forget the warnings of God. Forget his covenant with the woman who shared his life and calling. She spoke of comfort, of rest from the hardships of the wilderness. She promised food without toil shelter, without labor companionship, without the demands of obedience. Then her words grew bolder. "I can give you more than what you lost. Power over this land, authority over all living things. No more fear, no more waiting for promises that never come." It was a master stroke. In that moment, Adam's mind flashed with the memory of Eden, the fruit-laden trees, the cool shade, the rivers of life. His heart ached and his steps faltered. The temptation was not wrapped in rage or threat. It came dressed as kindness, as hope. But deep within, another memory stirred: the voice. The command in Eden that had been clear, unbending, and full of love. "You shall have no other gods before me." The memory rose like a wall between him and the illusion. The words of God became a mirror, and in that mirror the beauty twisted. The eyes that seemed so inviting now glimmered with malice. The voice that promised peace now dripped with contempt. Adam stepped back, and the mask slipped. The woman's form wavered, and in its place the shadowed figure of the enemy emerged, smiling, but with the cold smile of a predator who had nearly won. "Every blessing not from God," Adam said aloud, "is a trap in disguise." The illusion shattered like glass. Satan's form twisted and retreated into the wilderness, his plans for this day undone. But the battle had left its mark. Adam returned to the cave, shaken not because he had fallen, but because he realized how close he had come. The text records that Adam told Eve everything. They prayed through the night, asking God for discernment that they might see through any mask the enemy wore. This was the birth of spiritual vigilance, the understanding that evil often comes dressed in the garments of good, that not every opportunity is divine, and that some doors lead straight back into chains. For the Ethiopian tradition, this episode is more than ancient history. It is a warning for every generation. The most dangerous deceptions are not the ones we can easily recognize, but the ones that look like answers to our prayers. Adam learned in that moment what we must learn now: the enemy knows how to counterfeit light. He can weave desire, beauty, and promise into something that feels like destiny, but is designed to destroy. And so the Cave of Treasures became more than a refuge, it became a watchtower. For Adam knew the enemy would return again, and next time the disguise might be even harder to see. And in the days to come, another sacred moment would test them not through temptation, but through the covenant of marriage itself. Chapter 4. A marriage ordained by God. After the encounter with the enemy's disguise, Adam and Eve understood something profound. Purity was not merely about avoiding sin, it was about waiting for God's timing. They knew that even the most sacred desires could be corrupted if pursued outside of His command. And so, according to the book of Adam and Eve, they entered into a season unlike anything they had known in Eden, a period of separation, prayer, and fasting before they would unite as husband and wife. The text records the number precisely 223 days. That is over 7 months of restraint, discipline, and watchfulness. Day after day, Adam would rise at the first light and pray, asking for God's blessing to rest upon his future union. Eve, too, would keep her vigil, her prayers echoing against the walls of the cave of treasures. They would meet, speak briefly, share food gathered from the wilderness, and then retreat again to their separate places of prayer. This was not simply a test of self-control. It was a declaration that their covenant would not be founded on impulse, but on divine appointment. In Eden, marriage had been a gift given instantly. In exile, it had to be contended for, purified and prepared like an offering. At last the day came when God spoke, confirming the time was right. Adam and Eve emerged from their season of preparation into the wilderness sun. The book describes the ceremony with symbolic precision. God Himself brought forth 3 gifts: gold, myrrh, and frankincense. Gold, the emblem of kingship, foreshadowed the reign of the Messiah who would come through their distant line. Myrrh, used for anointing and burial, foretold the suffering and sacrifice that would one day bring redemption. Frankincense, the fragrance of worship, pointed to restored communion between God and His people. These were not random offerings, they were prophetic signposts. Centuries later, wise men from the East would bring the same 3 gifts to the newborn Christ, sealing the connection between the first covenant of marriage and the ultimate covenant of salvation. But even this holy moment was not free from attack. The enemy, having failed with despair and failed with beauty, now sought to corrupt something sacred from within. The book says, Satan watched their union from a distance, whispering schemes into the air. Turn their covenant into a chain. Turn their love into hunger. Let them mistake desire for devotion. The implication is chilling. Marriage was not just a gift. It was the first battlefield of humanity. If the enemy could twist the purpose of this union, he could poison the foundation of family legacy and the future generations that God intended to raise in righteousness. Adam and Eve, however, had been forged in hardship. They guarded their vows as one guards a city under siege. They did not let physical desire overtake spiritual purpose. They built their life together not on fleeting passion, but on shared obedience. This is why Ethiopian tradition elevates their union as more than historical, it is prophetic. It tells us that every true covenant will be contested. Every God-ordained union will face storms designed to shift its center from God's will to human craving. And the moment a covenant center shifts, the enemy gains ground. For Adam and Eve, the marriage covenant was not the end of temptation. It was the beginning of a deeper form of warfare. 2 lives bound together under God became a threat to the kingdom of darkness, and that threat would be met with new forms of assault in the years to come. But for now, their covenant stood. In the cave of treasures, they learned to love as warriors, not just as companions. And from that love, children would be born, children whose stories would both carry promise and open the door to the first bloodshed in human history. Chapter 6. Seth and the Mountain of Holiness. After Abel's death and Cain's exile, a deep shadow hung over Adam and Eve's household. But into that sorrow, God gave another son, Seth, whose name means appointed. Eve herself said, God has appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. The book of Adam and Eve, alongside Ethiopian tradition, records that Seth was unlike his brothers. His countenance bore a quiet strength, and his heart leaned toward God from his earliest days. Adam, recognizing the calling on his son's life, set him apart. He was to be the keeper of the covenant, the guardian of the promise, the one who would preserve the line through which redemption would come. Under Adam's guidance, Seth and his descendants withdrew from the lowlands and ascended to the high places, a region later known as Mount Hermon. There the air was clean, the land untouched by Cain's bloodline, and the people devoted themselves to worship, purity, and the remembrance of God's command. From the heights they could look down and see the fertile plains below, where Cain's descendants built cities, forged tools, and began to shape a culture apart from God. For generations, the sons of Seth remained on the mountain. They sang songs to the Creator, kept the sacred stories, and guarded themselves from the corruption below. The mountain became known as the Mountain of Holiness, a place set apart. But holiness is not preserved by location alone, it must be preserved in the heart. The book of Adam and Eve warns that over time the people on the mountain began to hear faint echoes from the valley music unlike the worship they knew. At first it was curiosity. Then came the rumors of festivals, of dancing, of colors and sounds they had never seen. The descendants of Cain had mastered the craft of celebration flutes and drums. Ornaments of gold and silver garments dyed in brilliant colors. One by one, the young men of Seth's line began to descend, telling themselves they would only look, only listen. But beauty can be as dangerous as the serpent's tongue. In the valley they saw the daughters of Cain, women of striking form and bold presence. Their laughter was intoxicating, their movements like spells. The sons of Seth did not return alone. They took wives from among them, crossing the line God had drawn between the holy and the profane. These unions were not merely cultural exchanges, they were spiritual fusions. The scriptures and the book of Enoch speak of this time as the doorway through which corruption flooded the earth. The offspring of these marriages became known as the Nephilim, giants of great strength, fierce in war, but violent and morally corrupt. They filled the land with bloodshed, arrogance, and rebellion against God. What began as a few steps down the mountain turned into a mass exodus. The mountain's songs grew silent, its altars abandoned. Those who remained found themselves outnumbered and tempted. Slowly, the mountain of holiness became a memory rather than a dwelling place. It is here the prophetic lesson cuts deep. Holiness compromised. Destruction inevitable. The sons of Seth did not fall in a single moment. It was the slow erosion of separation, the belief that they could mix devotion with disobedience and escape the consequences. The compromise did not only invite corruption, it invited exile of the heart. The altars on Hermon grew quiet. The songs of the high places were drowned by the drums of the lowlands. Names blurred, callings dimmed, and identity bled into the valley. When holiness is traded for applause, a people forgets who they are. And when a people forget who they are, someone else will name them. That is how exile begins. Not first with chains on the wrists, but with amnesia in the soul. The question is no longer, how tall are the giants, but who are we now? And that is where our investigation turns next, into the long shadow of exile that reaches from the children of Eden into every age that followed. Chapter 7. From Eden's children to the world's exiles. By the time the sons of Seth descended from the mountain of holiness, something irreversible had begun. The children of Eden were no longer marked solely by their Creator's image. They were shaped by the culture of rebellion. The bloodline that was meant to preserve the covenant had mixed with the line that rejected it. And with this blending came not only moral decay, but a slow erasure of identity. The book of Adam and Eve tells us that Adam's descendants once carried a clear memory of who they were, the chosen seed appointed to guard the promise of restoration. But when they left their place of separation, they lost more than their physical home. They lost their spiritual compass. They became wanderers not only across the land but within their own souls. Here the Ethiopian tradition draws a sobering parallel, a parallel that echoes in the modern world. Just as the children of Eden drifted from their mountain, many peoples in history have been torn from their homelands, stripped of their language, culture, and history until they no longer recognize themselves. Among these, the experience of the African diaspora is perhaps one of the most striking. taken from their lands, scattered across nations, forced into systems designed to erase their heritage. This was not merely the theft of labor or freedom, it was the theft of identity. The songs, the stories, the names, and the lineages were deliberately severed, leaving only fragments. Generations grew up knowing they belonged to something greater, but unable to name it. In prophetic language, this is what exile truly means. Exile is not only about distance from a homeland, it is about disconnection from origin and purpose. When you no longer remember who you are, the enemy doesn't need to chain your body. Your mind and spirit are already bound. This is why the ancient Ethiopian manuscripts speak so urgently about Adam's children in exile. They describe them as living in a dark cave, not of stone, but of the mind, a prison of forgetfulness. This modern cave can be seen anywhere that a people have been taught to despise their own reflection, to doubt their worth, and to surrender their divine inheritance in exchange for the comfort of survival. It is here we encounter the wave peak truth. The greatest theft is the theft of identity. When identity is stolen, generations can live as captives without realizing they are in chains. They may work, build, and achieve, yet remain far from the destiny for which they were created. But the Ethiopian tradition does not leave the story in despair. It insists that recovery is possible, but it requires a return not merely to a geographical place, but to the knowledge of origin. For the children of Eden, the path back was to remember the covenant and the God who gave it. For those in any age, the path is the same: to reject the lies about who they are and reclaim the truth of who God says they are. Adam's exile was physical. His descendants' exile became cultural and spiritual. Today's exile, whether of a people group or an individual, is often internal, hidden behind the appearance of freedom. Yet the same God who called Seth to the mountain calls his people now to rise from the valleys of compromise and remember. Because the enemy's oldest strategy has never changed. If he cannot destroy you, he will try to make you forget who you are. And when you forget, you surrender your authority without a fight. But the story is not over. Even in exile, God preserves a remnant, a people who remember, a people who guard the truth, a people who will rise when the appointed time comes. And in the mountains of Ethiopia, a book still waits, a book older than kings and empires, one that speaks not only of Adam's exile, but of the watchers who came down, the giants they produced, and the judgment that would shake the whole earth. That book is the Book of Enoch. Chapter 8. The Book of Enoch and the Watchers. High in the mountains of Ethiopia, hidden in monasteries carved from living rock, lies a book the Western world only knows in fragments. It is the Book of Enoch, preserved in its entirety in the ancient Ge'ez language, while the rest of the world clings to scattered pages and passing references. Genesis 5 gives us only a passing glimpse. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. But the Ethiopian manuscripts open the door to the life behind that mystery, a life that would put Enoch at the center of one of the most shocking and dangerous episodes in human history. The book begins with a warning, words written not for Enoch's generation alone, but for a distant generation living in an age of great deception. It tells of beings called the Watchers, angelic guardians appointed by God to watch over humanity. But these watchers abandoned their post. Drawn by the beauty of human women, they descended from heaven to the earth and took them as wives. The Book of Enoch names their leader Semjaza and describes their pact. Each swore an oath that none would turn back from the plan. This was not a single act of rebellion, it was a coordinated invasion. The unions between the Watchers and human women produced offspring unlike any the world had ever seen: the Nephilim. Giants of immense size and power, they were not only physically imposing but spiritually corrupted, consuming the earth's resources and spreading violence without restraint. But the danger was not in their strength alone. The Watchers taught humanity knowledge that God had withheld for a reason: sorcery, enchantments, the crafting of weapons, the manipulation of nature, and even forbidden astronomy that blurred the line between worship and idolatry. What they called wisdom was in truth a weapon against the order God had set. The Ethiopian tradition treats this not as a myth, but as a historical account of why the world became so corrupt that the flood was inevitable. It reminds us that the battle for humanity's destiny has always been both physical and spiritual. Enoch enters the scene not as a passive observer, but as God's chosen messenger to confront these fallen beings. The book records that he was taken into the heavenly courts, shown visions of the cosmos, and entrusted with the decree of judgment. Imagine the weight, a man of flesh delivering a death sentence to beings of celestial glory. Enoch stood before the watchers and declared their fate, that they would be bound in the abyss until the great day of judgment, that their children the Nephilim would perish in the flood, and that the knowledge they had corrupted would turn against them. It is here the wave peak cuts deep. Even angels can fall and take the world with them. For the early Ethiopian church, the Book of Enoch was not simply history, it was prophecy. It showed that the corruption of the last days would mirror the days of Noah's unnatural unions, the misuse of advanced knowledge, and a global culture bent on self-exaltation. Jesus himself in Matthew 24 warned that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. The West, having lost most of Enoch's text for centuries, often treated the fragments as curiosities. But in Ethiopia, the book remained in the canon, read alongside Genesis and Isaiah, its warnings as relevant as the Gospels. The preservation was intentional because to forget what happened with the Watchers is to be blind to the enemy's oldest strategies. And those strategies are not buried in the past. The spirit of the Watchers, the drive to blend rebellion with progress, to disguise corruption as enlightenment, is alive in our own age. The difference is that now their forbidden knowledge wears the face of technology, science, and innovation. Enoch's confrontation with the Watchers is more than an ancient tale. It is a mirror. It asks the question if such beings could fall from heaven's light into the deepest darkness. What makes us think humanity is immune to the same descent? And as the earth groaned under the weight of their corruption, God prepared a judgment unlike anything the world had ever seen. A flood that would wash away giants, cleanse the earth, and preserve a single family whose bloodline remained untainted. Chapter 9. The Flood as a Genetic Reset. By the time of Noah, the earth was no longer the world Adam had walked. The line between human and something else had blurred. The Book of Enoch, preserved in full in Ethiopia, describes it plainly. The Nephilim had filled the land, devouring its resources, enslaving its people, and spilling innocent blood until the very soil cried out to heaven. Genesis 6 says, "All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth." This was not poetic exaggeration. The corruption was not only moral, it was biological. The descendants of the Watchers had intertwined their bloodline with humanity's, distorting the image of God imprinted in man from the beginning. The seed through which the Messiah would come was under siege not just by sin, but by alteration. God's judgment in the form of the flood was not an act of random wrath, it was a surgical strike. It was both a cleansing of the earth's wickedness and what could be called a genetic reset. Humanity's original design as God had made it had to be preserved for the promise in Eden to remain possible. Here enters Noah. Scripture tells us Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. The Hebrew phrase perfect in his generations, tamim, refers not just to moral integrity but to physical wholeness, untainted lineage. In other words, Noah's family had not been corrupted by the hybridization of the Nephilim. This is why he was chosen, not because he was flawless in behavior, but because his line remained a pure vessel for the covenant yet to come. The Ethiopian tradition adds that Noah's righteousness was visible in his refusal to participate in the feast's violence and sorcery of the age. While others pursued the wisdom taught by the Watchers, Noah clung to the ancient instructions handed down from Adam through Seth. He built altars, he offered sacrifices to God alone, and he kept himself apart from the alliances that brought ruin to others. When the decree of the flood came, it was not merely a warning of disaster, it was the last invitation to turn back. Noah preached for decades while constructing the ark, his very labor a testimony to the coming judgment. But the people mocked. Why believe in a God you cannot see when you can build cities with your own hands and master the secrets of heaven through forbidden knowledge? Then the skies opened. The fountains of the deep broke apart. Rain fell in sheets the earth had never known. The waters rose, swallowing fields, cities, and fortresses. Giants fell beneath the waves. The sound of the Nephilim's strength, the roar of their armies, was silenced under the crushing flood. It is here the wave peak speaks. Judgment was mercy for the human race. If God had allowed the corruption to continue unchecked, there would have been no untainted humanity left, no vessel for the Messiah, no fulfillment of the promise made to Eve. The flood was not only an end, it was a beginning. From the ark, a new chapter of humanity emerged. But the memory of the watchers did not die in the water. Their spirits, according to Enoch, became the wandering entities the Bible calls unclean spirits, restless, bodiless, still seeking to influence mankind. The world was cleansed, but the war was far from over. And so Noah's survival was more than a rescue. It was a preservation of the covenant line, a divine intervention to safeguard the future. Every rainbow since has been a reminder that God's judgment and mercy often walk hand in hand, and that sometimes to save the future, He must end the present. But the story does not stop on the mountains of Ararat. Far away in the highlands of Ethiopia, a people would become the guardians of this ancient memory, holding not only the story of the flood, but the very books that explain why it had to happen. And those guardians still keep watch today, in monasteries carved from stone where the word and the warning are bound together for the last days. Chapter 10, Ethiopia. Guardians of the prophetic memory. Long after the waters of the flood receded, after Noah's sons spread across the continents, and nations rose and fell, there remained a thread of preservation, an unbroken line of guardianship that would find its home in the highlands of Ethiopia. While empires in the West shifted their borders and rewrote their histories, Ethiopia remained a fortress both in geography and in faith. Its mountains rising like ancient sentinels shielded a people who did not merely read the scriptures, they lived them. And in their hands were manuscripts the rest of the world had lost. For millennia, Ethiopian monks have lived in monasteries carved from sheer rock high above the valleys where time seems to move slower. These are not the ornate cathedrals of Europe, but sanctuaries of stone hewn by hand, hidden from invaders, and consecrated for one purpose: to guard the testimony entrusted to them. Among their treasures are two works. The Western canon abandoned the Book of Enoch and the Book of Adam and Eve. To the Ethiopian Church, these are not curiosities or secondary writings, they are integral parts of the sacred record. Where the West saw them as dangerous or unnecessary, Ethiopia saw them as vital warnings for the generations living in the shadow of the last days. The monks do not preserve these texts out of mere tradition. They believe them to be prophetic in nature, blueprints for recognizing the spiritual patterns that repeat in human history. The rebellion of the Watchers, the corruption before the flood, the exile of Adam and Eve. These are not stories locked in the ancient past. They are templates of how the enemy works, how humanity falls, and how God intervenes. For centuries, foreign powers tried to take these manuscripts. Some came with armies, others with gold, others under the guise of scholarship. But the guardians were not easily deceived. Manuscripts were hidden in underground chambers, sealed in stone libraries where only the trusted could enter. In some cases, the monks memorized entire books, so that even if the parchment was destroyed, the word would not perish. It is here the wave peak speaks. When the West forgot, Ethiopia remembered. While Western Christianity gradually lost the context of Genesis, stripping away the layers that explain the war after Eden, Ethiopia kept the full narrative alive. When the West debated whether Enoch was allegory or myth, Ethiopia kept reading it as prophecy. And when the story of Adam and Eve ended at Eden's gate in Western pulpits, Ethiopian believers continued the journey into the Cave of Treasures, learning how to fight the same enemy. This is why Ethiopia has often been targeted not only politically but spiritually. If you can silence the guardians, you can cut off access to the very warnings that could awaken the world. But to this day, the ancient church stands its priests in white robes chanting the same words sung for centuries, holding manuscripts that smell of myrrh and thyme. Prophetically, the preservation of these books in Ethiopia carries a message for the modern believer. Truth may be suppressed, but God always raises up a remnant to keep it alive. The question is never whether the truth exists, it is whether we will seek it. And as the shadows of our own age grow darker with the return of forbidden knowledge, the rise of global systems of control, and the erosion of spiritual identity, these Ethiopian manuscripts read less like history and more like headlines. They are not simply relics, they are roadmaps pointing from the first war in Eden to the final battle in Revelation. From their mountain sanctuaries, the guardians still whisper the same warning: the patterns are returning. The days of Noah are not behind us, they are before us. And in that return lies the next great test of humanity, which is why the spirit of the Watchers has found new forms in our own time. Chapter 11. The Modern Watchers and the New Forbidden Knowledge. For centuries, the Book of Enoch lay in Ethiopia's monasteries as both a record and a warning, a reminder of what happens when heavenly knowledge is twisted into weapons. The Watchers descended with secrets not meant for human hands, and the world before the flood collapsed under the weight of that corruption. But if you think their story ended in the deep prison described in Enoch, look again. The spirit of the Watchers, the same rebellion, the same seduction of forbidden knowledge still lives. Only now it wears a different face. In our age, the tools have changed, but the pattern has not. Where the Watchers taught the ancient world metalworking, sorcery, and genetic corruption, our generation is unlocking technologies that carry the same potential for destruction. We call it progress, but in prophetic language, it is the return of an old playbook. Artificial intelligence now learns faster than any human mind, absorbing the sum of human knowledge and then creating knowledge of its own. Genomic editing promises to perfect human DNA, altering traits, removing diseases, but also opening the door to altering what it means to be human. Biological weapons designed in hidden labs have the power to end millions of lives without firing a single shot. Individually, each of these could be a tool for good. Together, they form a dangerous cocktail of power that in the wrong hands could erase the line between creation and creator. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers' gifts to humanity as knowledge that led astray. It was not the information itself that was evil, but its use outside of God's boundaries. The same is true now. AI could feed the hungry or enslave thought itself. Genetic engineering could heal or build something no longer fully human. Advanced weaponry could protect or annihilate with the push of a button. This is why the Ethiopian church reads Enoch not as a relic of ancient myth, but as a prophetic lens for the present. The parallels are too sharp to ignore. The ancient Watchers crossed a divine boundary. Today, our scientists and innovators stand on the edge of similar lines, and the question is not can we cross them, but should we? The rebellion of the Watchers was not just about knowledge, it was about authority. They did not want to serve under God's order, they wanted to set their own. This is the same spirit that drives much of our technological ambition today, the belief that we can become the architects of our own evolution, that we can transcend our humanity without the God who gave it. Here the wave peak strikes. The ancient rebellion is now in silicon and steel. The divine boundaries that once existed in heaven and on earth are now being tested in laboratories and data centers. And just like before, the world applauds, unaware that the same pattern of corruption is repeating. Prophetically, this is the danger. The return of forbidden knowledge in our generation will not look like angels descending. It will look like innovation conferences, medical breakthroughs, and AI-powered revolutions. It will come to us wrapped as solutions to our problems, just as Satan came to Adam, disguised as a blessing. The West may have forgotten Enoch's warnings, but the patterns are playing out exactly as he described. The temptation is not only to use this knowledge, but to worship it, to treat technology as our savior, our healer, our God. And just as in the days of Noah, the corruption is accelerating. The question is not whether judgment will come, it is how far the world will go before it arrives. From Ethiopia's mountains to the global stage, the thread of prophecy is unbroken. We are living in the echo of an ancient rebellion. And if the parallels hold, the next act will not be one of quiet progress. It will be one of open confrontation between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of God. And that confrontation is already foreshadowed in the last book of the Bible. Chapter 12, Revelation's Black Messiah and the Fall of Babylon. The final book of the Bible, Revelation pulls back the curtain on the climax of the story that began in Eden. It is not merely a series of visions, it is the final act of a war that has spanned all of human history. And in its opening chapter, John gives us a description of the risen Christ, unlike any portrait hanging in Western churches. His head and hair were white, like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. Revelation 1:14-15. The Ethiopian tradition has long held this description, literally treating the wool-like hair and the burnished brass skin as real physical characteristics. In doing so, they preserved an image of the Messiah that defied the sanitized, Europeanized depictions that later dominated art. This was not the pale, fragile Christ of medieval paintings, but a figure rooted in the earth, radiant in glory and unmistakably fierce. This Christ stands in contrast to the world system described in Revelation as Babylon. Babylon is more than an ancient city. It is a symbol of the global network of oppression, greed, and idolatry that spans from Nimrod's tower to the present age. It is a system that seduces nations with wealth, enslaves souls through desire, and persecutes the righteous who refuse its mark. Revelation portrays Babylon as a merchant queen intoxicated with her own power, clothed in luxury, and drunk on the blood of the saints. And just as the Watchers built cities of rebellion before the flood, so Babylon builds an empire that unites politics, economics, and religion into a counterfeit kingdom. But God's people are not abandoned in this system. John is shown a vision of 144,000 sealed servants of God, 12,000 from each tribe of Israel. Who are they? Western interpretations often treat them as symbolic, yet Ethiopian and certain Hebraic traditions suggest they may be literal descendants of the tribes scattered and hidden among the nations, their identity lost through exile, just as the children of Eden's covenant lost theirs. These could include communities long disconnected from their heritage, yet marked in heaven for this appointed time. The sealing of the 144,000 is a sign that God's covenant people will stand in the midst of the storm. It is both a promise of protection and a summons to faithfulness when the world system demands compromise. Then comes the battle that all prophecy has been building toward Armageddon. Here, the Black Messiah of Revelation does not come as the suffering servant of the Gospels, but as the conquering king. His robe is dipped in blood, not his own this time, but as a sign of victory over his enemies. On his head are many crowns, and on his thigh is written King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The armies of heaven follow him clothed in white, riding on horses. The beast and the kings of the earth gather to make war, but they fall in a moment, defeated not by nuclear power or human armies, but by the word that proceeds from his mouth. Babylon collapses in a single hour, her merchants wailing. Her music silenced, her lights extinguished. Here is the wave peak that ties the entire story together, from Adam's exile to Christ's kingdom. The war ends. The curse that began in the garden is finally broken. The deceiver who tempted Eve, who corrupted the Watchers, who seduced nations into Babylon's web, is bound and cast into the lake of fire. A new heaven and a new earth appear. The tree of life, once barred by flaming swords, now stands in the center of the city, its leaves for the healing of the nations. There is no temple for God, and the Lamb are its light. The exile is over. The inheritance is restored. But one final call remains to choose now which kingdom we belong to before the king returns to claim what is his. Chapter 13. Final call. Return to the inheritance. From the moment Adam and Eve stepped out of Eden's gate, the world has been living in exile. The journey we've traced from the Cave of Treasures to the days of Enoch and the Watchers, through the cleansing of the flood into Ethiopia's mountains, and finally to the visions of Revelation, has been one unbroken story. It is the history of a family line meant to preserve a covenant, the story of how that covenant was attacked, nearly erased yet guarded by a faithful remnant until the appointed time. Eden was where we lost our inheritance. Enoch stood against those who tried to corrupt it. The flood preserved it. Ethiopia guarded its records. Revelation promises its restoration. The thread runs straight through history, but here is the sobering truth: threads can be cut and inheritance can be forgotten. The message for us today is not simply to admire the story from a distance. It is to recognize that we are living in its final chapters. The patterns we've seen in ancient times, the lure of forbidden knowledge, the theft of identity, the seduction of false blessing, are not distant history. They are here dressed in modern clothes, speaking our language, promising the same things the serpent promised in the beginning. You can be like God. To the older generation listening, perhaps you have seen these patterns play out over decades. You've watched the world change at a pace unthinkable in your youth. Traditions have been eroded, truth has been redefined, faith has been treated as outdated, and yet the prophetic record tells us this is exactly how the final act unfolds. The question is, will we be awake when it does? Returning to the inheritance begins with remembering who we are. We are not accidents of history or mere survivors of a broken world. We are the descendants of a covenant that began in the garden. That covenant is not written in our DNA alone, but in the image of God stamped on every soul. To forget that is to remain in the modern cave, alive yet living in the dark. The book of Adam and Eve teaches us that exile is a place of preparation, not permanent defeat. The book of Enoch warns that the enemy's strategies repeat themselves generation after generation. Revelation shows us that the war will end, but not with negotiations, with the return of the rightful king. So how do we return to the inheritance? We do it by rejecting the counterfeit blessings that promise comfort, but lead to bondage. By guarding the truth we've been given, even if the world mocks or ignores it. By seeking the wisdom of God over the knowledge that puffs up and destroys. And by aligning ourselves with the King, who will not only end the exile but restore the garden in a form more glorious than it was in the beginning. There is also this: the story is not yet complete. Across deserts, under monasteries and vaults beneath ancient churches, there are still texts waiting to be uncovered. Records of the earliest generations' writings that may shed more light on the first war of humanity. If God has preserved them this long, perhaps it is because they will be needed in the days ahead. And so we arrive at the closing wave peak, a question that is both personal and prophetic. The first exile is ending. Will you return? This is not a call to nostalgia. It is not a romantic longing for the past. It is a summons to step into the identity and authority you were always meant to have, to stand against the darkness as Adam was meant to, as Enoch did, as the 144,000 will. When the King comes, the gates will open again, not to let us out, but to welcome us home. And in that moment, the inheritance will no longer be a promise. It will be our reality. Until then, the choice is ours.